I gave myself writing prompts every day for a month, and it re-energized my creative practice in some exciting ways. Hi there! Thanks for being here today. Now, if you're anything like me, you just don't write as much as you'd like to, and I do realize that sounds a little silly to say. My job is basically all writing, and I spend a lot of time writing for this show. But what I mean is that I don't do the kind of creative writing that I want to do as often as I'd like. I was thinking about that the other day, and it led me to a few realizations. First, I just don't feel terribly inspired lately. Second, when I was a student, I somehow always did have things to write about. And third, when I look at my own students now, they always seem to be able to come up with interesting things to write and mostly always get their assignments turned in on time. And while there may be other things at play, I noticed that my previous self and my current students all had something that I just don't have anymore. A steady stream of writing prompts. When I had teachers giving me prompts and exercises to point me in a specific direction, I had no trouble coming up with things to write about, and those seeds often produced poems or essays that I was genuinely excited about. Since then, I've mostly been at the mercy of whenever inspiration has chosen to strike, and whenever I was also in a position to write or type in response to that inspiration. But, as is often the case, when I sat down to write, there was nothing there, and when I felt inspired, I also had no way to write anything down, so the idea was lost to the ether. So, believe it or not a lot of writing got done. That's when I decided that I didn't need to be in a class to have writing prompts. I could give them to myself. So I planned a month of giving myself daily writing prompts. I had two goals in mind while setting up my plan. First, of course, to write more and to write more regularly. And second, to get some practice making up prompts. It's a big part of teaching writing, but nobody ever really teaches you how to write a good prompt. So I wanted to see what I could learn about prompt writing throughout the course of the month, too. From there, the process was pretty simple. On the last day of April, I wrote myself a prompt for the next day, and then I'd start a pattern of writing something in response to that prompt, and then finishing my writing session by writing a prompt for the next day. For me, all of these prompts and responses were poetry, but all writing is writing, so don't feel like this won't work if you primarily write something else. Finally, though, you know what they say, you can never have too many variables when you run an experiment. So I also decided that I wanted to do it by hand, which has some implications that we'll get to later. So I grabbed one of my many partially filled notebooks and a pen, and I set myself up for the grand experiment in giving myself daily writing prompts. But before I tell you all that I learned along the way, here's a quick word about today's sponsor. In a data-driven world, our personal information becomes a target for exploitation. For example, ABC News recently reported that over 73 million AT&T customer records were leaked on the dark web. And that's to say nothing of the many data brokers collecting and selling our data legally. So that's why I've been using Aura, the sponsor of today's video. Aura offers an array of data security services in one app in order to protect my personal information and remove it from data brokers' listings. In fact, just seconds after I'd registered, Aura had already initiated takedown requests with nearly a dozen data brokers. Since then, it's been reassuring to get weekly reports of where Aura has found my data and worked to take it down. But what I like the most is that that's not all Aura does. Transaction monitoring, identity protections, a VPN. You could go to 5 or 6 apps to get all these security services, or with Aura, you can go to just one. It's a convenient multi-purpose tool for protecting your privacy and improving your personal data security. So go to aura.com/writingwithandrew to start your free 2-week trial of Aura. The link is in the description. And now, back to the show. Guess what? Well, it turns out that giving myself 31 writing prompts over the course of a month meant that I wrote 31 new things. So I guess the first and most important takeaway is that giving yourself prompts is a great way to get yourself writing. It works, but I learned more than just the fact that prompts will, well, prompt me to write. And the first is that I do and did have good ideas. If you had asked me before this experience whether I had good ideas for poems, I would have said that I'm sure I could find some, but that I didn't really have any at the moment. In other words, I might have had every good intention to write more than I was. But I also didn't have a real sense of direction, and I wondered why I didn't have ideas like I could remember having at other times in my writing life. Just sitting down to write wasn't terribly fruitful because I wasn't convinced I had anything to write. But sitting down to respond to a prompt was a really different experience. I didn't have to pluck an idea for a poem out of the air. Instead, I just had to write about something that fit the prompt I had given myself. I once had a teacher who described writing prompts as enabling constraints. Where a writer has unlimited possibility, their ability to write may end up being limited by the overload of options. If you could write about anything, how do you just pick one thing out of an infinity? A prompt can work to eliminate options and give you a sense of direction that allows you to go forward. So when I sat down on day one with a prompt that said, write about a fresh start and start with the result, I didn't sit down and say, oh boy, what am I going to write about today? Instead, I sat down and immediately started reviewing memories and experiences of getting a fresh start on something. And even then, I didn't have to think about how to start the poem. I knew that I would start with the outcome of that fresh start. And pretty quickly, I was writing about my first, or rather second, attempt at making a dry caramel, starting with the glossy golden ribbons of caramel, and then working my way back to the soaking, scrubbing, and scowling, and finally to the moment of hesitation that pushed me past dark amber and into the acrid, smoky realm of burned sugar. And from there, I went. Now, I'll confess that I didn't quite write every day. Sometimes I just didn't get around to it, but I did make sure to make up the days that I had missed. Not because I think you have to go back and make up days that you miss, but because I gave myself writing prompts for several days this month. It's not really as compelling of a video title. But anyway, whether I was writing one poem a day or sometimes pulling double duty, I never ran into a prompt that I didn't have something to write about. For every prompt, I was able to find an idea. And that's what I mean when I say it turns out I actually have good ideas, but I had a hard time recognizing them, or maybe better selecting them and then writing about them. So prompts help me to narrow down the search in my mental catalog to constrain my thinking enough to enable me to write. So if you're thinking you just don't have any good ideas, well, I'd be a little skeptical. Write a prompt for yourself and see what ideas come to you in response. Sometimes, in fact, when I finished a poem for the day and tried to think of a prompt for the next day, I already had an idea for a new poem ready to go, so I just made that the prompt. For example, I've spent a lot of time thinking about the times that I'd go walking in the woods in the spring of 2020, listening to the cardinals in the trees as I found some time to get away from a little apartment and the global tensions of those days that everyone called surreal and unprecedented. And I was thinking about how totally unbothered by it all those birds were. So my prompt on the 15th day of the month was to finally write that cardinal poem, which, at least in its most rudimentary form, exists now, which is something I couldn't have said before. But for the most part, my prompts were challenges to myself to write about a particular kind of relationship dynamic, turning point in life, or some other kind of observation. Or to write in a particular form or with a particular technique. And every single time I managed to come up with something, which was an encouraging rebuttal to the time I'd spent wondering if I had somehow broken my creative processor. Now, that should not be taken to mean that every idea I came up with was a winner. Sometimes I ended up with real duds, like when I prompted myself to write about something that was in the news, or to write a poem in the shape of a circle with the last word leading again into the first. Those poems just weren't interesting. But this is the second lesson. Prompts can be a good way to help you to write more, and you're probably going to write better things if you're writing more often. So you can't and shouldn't expect to write something brilliant every time you sit down to write. But let's be generous and say that 30% of your ideas will be good. If you write 10 times a year only when inspiration strikes, well, then the odds are that you'll end up with about 3 good poems that year. But imagine you get started on 30 poems in a month. At 30%, you now have the potential to write about 9 good poems. Do that every month and you'll have over 100 promising poems, compared to the 3 you might get if you put all your eggs into a basket of 10 moments of great inspiration. So prompts can help you to write more regularly and help you to see that you have more ideas than you thought. And writing regularly and generating a lot of ideas can also help you to put less pressure on your ideas. When you know that they can't all be winners, you can worry less about the quality of your initial ideas and instead focus on just generating them. And really, that's what this turned into for me. It was a way to generate ideas more than a way to write drafts of poems. And I think, at least in part, that was a consequence of my choice to write my prompts in a notebook. Some of my motivation came from all the romance surrounding doing things on paper. You'll hear a lot of people say that paper is more legitimate than digital, whether you're writing or reading. And I'll acknowledge that there's some research that suggests that certain things like note-taking work better when you write them by hand rather than type, but I think there is a lot to be said, too, for the aesthetic of doing things on paper. Is it always better? Or is it just more aesthetic? At any rate, I've written primarily with a word processor for as long as I can remember outside of writing in notebooks and classes. But at least since high school, if I had serious writing to do, I was at a computer. So I wanted to see what writing by hand was like, to see how or whether it would affect my writing process. And I will say, as so much of my other work has moved onto screens, I did like having some time away from screens. Sometimes I wrote in the late mornings, other times by lamplight before going to bed, but I did like the slower, quieter, less stimulating practice of sitting down with a notebook and pen. It's all screens now all the time, so it was nice to have something to do that felt productive that also didn't involve a bunch of digital input. But I will also say that I quickly got sick of trying to draft poems on paper. For me, there were a few key problems. One, there was an incompatibility between the size of the notebook and the size of my handwriting that meant that I continually ran out of page before I felt like I had reached the end of a line. So it got to be difficult to be true to my sensibilities for line length, and rather than feeling like an interesting way to approach lines differently, it just felt more like an ongoing frustration. So maybe a bigger notebook if you're like me. But the other, larger challenge was that I've grown accustomed to thinking of writing and the writing process as one of playing around with a malleable lump of stuff. In a word processor, it's really easy to rearrange words or lines, to change phrases, or to alter form on the fly. And the ability that working in a digital medium gives me to do that has become almost inseparable from my approach to poetry, for better or worse. Once words are on paper in ink, though, they kind of get stuck in a real material way. You can cross things out or draw arrows or put in slashes to mark different lines, but like the previous point, I found pen and paper resisting me more than helping me to write poems in the way that I wanted to. So by about day 9, I had given up trying to write drafts of poems and just switched to little prose poems. I got the basic moves and language I might imagine in a poem, but without any effort to shape it in the way I would have wanted to if it had been digital. And by the end of the month, I ended up mostly just sketching out ideas for poems more than trying to create any kind of draft. Which I don't feel bad about at all, because I was still creating more than I had been previously. I was learning about what works for me in my own writing process, and I was learning about writing prompts, which of course was another primary goal of the exercise. So by now, maybe you've been convinced to try giving yourself regular writing prompts, which leaves us with the question, how do you write good prompts for yourself? Well, I thought I'd never ask. So here's what I learned from creating prompts every day for a month. First, and least surprisingly, you want to create a prompt that is, in fact, a prompt that's generative. The idea here is to set yourself up with a jump start. So something like write a poem is, of course, not a useful prompt because it doesn't involve any enabling constraint. It's not even really a constraint at all. One of the easiest ways to think about it is to give yourself a specific task to accomplish. So I already mentioned prompts I gave myself, like write a poem about something in the news or write a poem about a fresh start, starting with the result. In both of these cases, I have a specific task to accomplish. These are prompts that help you to create new ideas by eliminating a lot of possible ideas. Or you could give yourself a specific technique-related task. For example, on day 2, I prompted myself to write a poem that combines 2 kinds of formal poetry into one new form. After a little bit of thought, I decided to smash together the august form of the sonnet with the silliness of a limerick to end up with a poem that went like this. The winter is finally done, the buzzing and blooming's begun. Each morning a bird makes a truly absurd, belligerent squawkety-caw that precedes my alarm. Here's a law I propose. Heretofore every bird I implore must be licensed to sing in the dark. Every robin or sparrow or lark must be cleared by the city to call out its ditty. And the fee should be terribly steep, since before 5's no time to cheep. I mean, what a literary achievement, my friends. We take the sonnet's 14 lines in general structure, but replace its inner workings with those of a limerick to end up with something potentially not quite as good as either. But not only does this prompt to combine 2 poetic forms into one give me a specific task, it also has the added benefit of disrupting my conventional patterns of thought. See, if you're not writing as regularly as you like, or even if you are, you're likely stuck in some kind of a rut, churning over the familiar again and again. So I could have just told myself to write a sonnet, but for me, that's not going to get me out of familiar paths. I've written lots of sonnets before. By combining two forms, though, I have to do something I haven't thought of before. I have to develop new ways of thinking or new strategies for writing. In that sense, a prompt can work to expand your writing range by gently forcing you to do something unusual or new. And it doesn't have to be form or technique based. On day 12, my prompt was a question. It's really common to see poems about flowers and birds and broken hearts, but I wondered to myself, can you write a video game poem? As I started writing about an early childhood memory, watching my mother play Tetris on a Game Boy, shadow blocks sliding down the green screen, I decided the answer was yes. I didn't really understand the game at the time, but I did understand that my mom was good at it, something that the jubilant animations that played after certain levels confirmed. When you write a prompt, you can also seed the qualities of a successful poem into your starting conditions. So you could prompt yourself to write about a specific topic or in a specific form, but you could also give yourself a prompt that requires the kinds of tensions and complexities that make for satisfying poetry. For example, I prompted myself one day to write about a change in a relationship. Already in this prompt, there's some human complexity, and it generated the idea for a poem about a close friend growing up that I ran into one day halfway through college, and we felt more or less like perfect strangers, and that was that. On another day, I prompted myself to write an elegy for what could have been. In that case, I ended up writing about the last day of 5th grade, a day that my family was moving and that a friend and I won a commanding victory in a 3-legged race, crossing the finish line while the other kids were still struggling to stand back up near the starting point. It was my first, greatest, and only athletic achievement, and since my family was moving, there was nobody to witness it. So what could have been, I wondered? Maybe we'd all be watching 3-legged racing with Andrew today. But maybe you're not too sure where to begin. Even ideas for prompts can be hard to come by. Well, fear not. Draw inspiration from a poem that you like. So, for example, I admire Ted Kooser's poem Depression Glass, which talks about a person by way of one of their possessions. Write a poem like that. Or one time I heard Rita Dove read a 26-line poem where each line cohered around the sounds of the corresponding letter of the alphabet. I tried something similar and wrote a 26-word poem that ended up being a lot of gross nonsense, but hey, they can't all be winners, can they? Which brings me to a couple of other insights. I really enjoyed thinking up prompts that focused on poetic form or technique, like combining forms or writing a poem with a repeated line, and I had fun writing them, but they often ended up feeling a little gimmicky, which I suppose is to be expected. When you're focused more on form than on saying something interesting, it's not really a surprise when you write something a little hollow. So there's nothing wrong with practicing technique, but if your goal is to generate something meaningful, you'll want to prioritize prompts that set you up for that. A combination prompt that gives you a sense of direction both in terms of content and form can put you on a more productive path. Like when I prompted myself to write about something I enjoy doing and also find a way to make the form emulate the activity. So I wrote about cutting carrots, the blade easing itself against the orange, and then the poem breaks up and scatters itself across the page alongside the little carrot coins that inevitably roll away. And don't be afraid of a truly unusual prompt. On day 17, my prompt was write a green poem, whatever that's supposed to mean. When I sat down to write, the greenest words I could think of were feathers and preening. Why are they green? I can't say. But as I thought about feathers and green, I ended up writing about a family I knew who kept a little green parrot who marched through the house like some kind of retired army officer, shouting at everyone to wake up. Long story short, like with poems, you can do whatever you want when writing prompts. They can be inspired by your immediate surroundings, poems you admire, or unique combinations of ideas or themes. Write about a day that only you commemorate. Write about a song and a person you associate with that song. Write a poem only in dialogue. As long as you're writing, you're doing the right thing. Now, in all this, I just want to emphasize that the goal here is practice. There's no pressure to write anything great. It's just to help you generate ideas when you might be feeling stuck. After all, responding to a prompt is just writing a first draft, and it's usually hubris to think that a first draft will be anything besides a very rough start. But this is why revision is a thing, and why revision is really where all the good stuff happens anyway. Just write, and like we said before, even if only 30% of your drafts are any good, that still puts you way ahead of yourself over time if prompts help you to write more frequently. Get the ideas out, all of them, and then you can hang on to the good ones. And even then, if none of your ideas are very good but you're having fun, That's still a win. On the last day of this month-long experiment, my prompt was to write an ode to the unfinished. A jigsaw puzzle scattered on the floor that I started and then realized I kind of hate doing jigsaw puzzles. A pile of books I started but never finished reading. Partial remnants of video scripts that never went anywhere. I want to be clear in finishing this video by saying that my point is not that you need to write yourself prompts for 31 days in order to make progress. Instead, it's that writing prompts for yourself can be an effective way to help you to generate new ideas and get out of a creative rut. If you do it 10 times or only 2, the value is in the doing, not only in the completing. So start writing, practice writing as regularly as you want to. Get distracted, live your life. I'm interested in giving you tools to accomplish what you want to, but never to tell you what does or doesn't count. But what does count, though, is that you've watched to the end. I really do appreciate it. There's a lot of stuff we all could be doing, so I'm grateful that you've chosen to spend some of your time with me. Now, go write yourself some prompts and then write some other stuff too, and you can tell me how it went next time we meet.